I should have known something was wrong when I saw my name card. While 200 guests filled the grand ballroom at my sister Rachel's wedding sipping champagne under crystal chandeliers, my seat was in the hallway on a folding chair next to the restrooms. Not a mistake. A message. You don't belong here. I sat there alone watching my own family celebrate through the doorway, pretending I didn't exist. My mother never once looked for me. Rachel laughed with her bridesmaids, radiant in her designer gown, while I fought back tears in my $50 dress under fluorescent lights. Then he appeared. A stranger in an expensive suit watching me with eyes that seemed to see everything. He sat down without asking, leaned close and whispered words that would change my life. Follow my lead. Pretend you're my date. Before I could respond, he took my hand and led me into that ballroom like I was royalty. When the best man finished his toast, this stranger, Ethan, took the microphone. The room fell silent. Rachel's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. "I'd like to talk about integrity," he began, his voice steady and cold. "About people who destroy others to build themselves up." Then he said my name, and my sister's perfect smile shattered like glass. What I didn't know was that this stranger held proof of a 15-year betrayal, one that had stolen my career, my inheritance, and my entire future. And tonight, he was going to expose it all. My name is Lauren Reed. I'm 38 years old, and for the past decade I've been working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, the kind of quiet, invisible job that pays the bills, but doesn't inspire dinner party conversation. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Once I had a corner office at one of the city's most prestigious investment firms. Once I had a future. But that was before everything fell apart, before the scandal that destroyed my career and scattered the pieces of my life like ashes in the wind. Now I live alone in a studio apartment, keep my head down, and try not to think too much about the woman I used to be. Today, though, I couldn't avoid thinking about it. Today was my sister Rachel's wedding. I'd almost declined the invitation when it arrived 3 months ago, thick cream cardstock with gold-embossed lettering, the kind of stationery that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. But some stubborn part of me, the part that still remembered what it felt like to belong to a family, insisted I should go. Maybe this would be different. Maybe Rachel had changed. Maybe, just maybe, they'd finally see me as something other than the family disappointment. I should have known better. The Grandview Hotel was exactly the kind of venue Rachel would choose, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers, the type of place where even the air felt expensive. I'd worn my nicest dress, a simple navy number I'd bought on sale 2 years ago, and spent an hour on my hair and makeup. Walking through those massive oak doors, I'd felt a flicker of something dangerous hope. The lobby was already filling with guests when I arrived. Women glided past in designer gowns, their jewelry catching the light, their laughter bright and confident. Men in tailored suits checked their phones and adjusted their cufflinks. I recognized some faces from childhood distant cousins, family friends, people who used to know my name. A few glanced at me with vague recognition before looking away, their expressions sliding from curiosity to polite disinterest in the span of a heartbeat. I found the seating chart displayed on an elegant easel near the ballroom entrance. My heart hammered as I scanned the alphabetized list, looking for my name among the table assignments. Table 1, immediate family. Table 2, the groom's parents and siblings. Table 3, Rachel's college friends. I kept reading my finger, trailing down the list past Table 10, Table 15, Table 20. My name wasn't there. For a moment, I thought there'd been a mistake. I checked again more carefully this time, my pulse loud in my ears. Still nothing. A woman in a hotel uniform approached, her smile professional and distant. "Can I help you find something? I'm looking for my table assignment. Lauren Reed. I'm the bride's sister." Her smile didn't waver, but something shifted in her eyes, pity maybe, or second-hand embarrassment. "Oh, yes. Just one moment." She pulled out a small notepad from her pocket and consulted it. "You're in the auxiliary seating area, just down that hallway to the left." Auxiliary seating area. The words hit me like a slap. I followed her directions, my heels clicking against the polished floor, each step taking me further from the warm glow of the ballroom. The hallway narrowed, the lighting shifting from the soft amber of chandeliers to the harsh fluorescent glare of utility spaces. I could smell the faint chemical tang of industrial cleaner. A door marked restrooms stood propped open, revealing gleaming white tile. And there, against the wall between the restrooms and a fire exit, sat a single folding chair. A cheap metal thing with a thin cushion, the kind you'd find in a church basement or community center. On the seat was a small place card with my name written in the same elegant calligraphy as the formal seating chart. Lauren Reed. I stared at it for a long moment, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of mistake, some bizarre mix-up that would be corrected any moment. But deep down in that place where truth lives even when we don't want to acknowledge it, I knew. This was deliberate. This was Rachel's doing. I sat down because I didn't know what else to do. The metal frame was cold even through my dress. From where I sat, I had a perfect view into the ballroom through the wide doorway, close enough to see everything too far away to be part of it. The room was breathtaking. Round tables draped in champagne-colored linens filled the space, each centerpiece a cascade of white roses and orchids. The head table sat on a raised platform decorated with fairy lights and trailing ivy. Guests were finding their seats now, greeting each other with hugs and air kisses, their voices creating a pleasant hum of anticipation. I saw my mother near the front, wearing a pale pink dress I'd never seen before, her silver hair swept up in an elegant twist. She was laughing at something my aunt said, her hand resting on the back of a chair at table 1. She looked beautiful and happy, completely at ease in this world of plenty. She didn't glance toward the hallway. Not once. A waiter in a crisp white jacket passed by, balancing a tray of champagne flutes and bacon-wrapped scallops. I watched him move through the ballroom, offering drinks and appetizers to the guests. He walked right past me without slowing down, as if the folding chair and the woman sitting on it were invisible. Even the staff could see I didn't belong here. I wanted to leave. Every cell in my body screamed at me to stand up, walk out those front doors and never look back. But my legs wouldn't move. I sat there frozen as memories I'd spent years trying to bury rose up like ghosts. I remembered my 8th birthday. Rachel had been 5, small and cute, with dark curls and big eyes that could melt anyone's heart. My parents had thrown her a party the week before, a princess theme with a bouncy castle and a magician and 30 of her little friends. For my birthday, my mother bought a sheet cake from the grocery store and sang to me at the kitchen table while my father worked late. When I'd asked why Rachel got a party, and I didn't, my mother had sighed and said, "You're older, Lauren. You understand that we can't do big celebrations every time. Rachel's still little." I remembered my college graduation. I'd worked so hard, finished in 3.5 years with honors, landed a job offer before I even walked across that stage. I'd sent my parents the ceremony details months in advance, highlighted the date on the calendar, reminded them a dozen times. The morning of graduation, my mother called to say they couldn't make it. Rachel had a dance recital, an important one, and she needed them there. "You understand, don't you, honey?" my mother had said. "You're so independent. Rachel needs more support." I'd walked across that stage and collected my diploma while my roommate's family cheered from the stands, pretending the empty seats beside them didn't matter. I remembered 1,000 small moments, each one a paper cut that didn't seem like much on its own, but together formed a pattern of neglect, so clear I couldn't understand how I'd ever missed it. Every milestone Rachel achieved was celebrated with fanfare and pride. Every accomplishment of mine was met with a nod and a "That's nice, dear," before the conversation shifted back to Rachel. The hallway seat wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was the truth of my place in this family made physical. I'd always been on the outside looking in, and now everyone could see it. The band started playing inside the ballroom, a string quartet performing something classical and beautiful. Guests settled into their seats, their chatter quieting to an expectant hum. I heard the click of heels on marble, saw Rachel sweep into view at the ballroom entrance on my father's arm. She looked stunning. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of lace and silk fitted perfectly to her slender frame, the train flowing behind her like water. Her dark hair was swept up in an intricate updo, her makeup flawless. She was everything a bride should be, radiant, confident, beautiful beyond words. She looked right past me as if I wasn't there. I felt something crack inside my chest, a fault line I'd been trying to hold together for years, finally giving way. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I blinked them back furiously. I wouldn't cry. Not here. Not where someone might see and report back to Rachel that I'd been weak, that I'd let her win. That's when I noticed him, a man in a dark suit, watching me from across the hallway, and something in his eyes told me he knew exactly why I was sitting there. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair touched with gray at the temples, and eyes that seemed to see straight through whatever polite masks people wore. His suit was custom-tailored, the kind that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent, charcoal gray, with subtle pinstripes that caught the light when he moved. But it wasn't the expensive clothes that made me notice him. It was the way he looked at me, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. He crossed the hallway with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. When he reached my pathetic folding chair, he didn't hesitate or ask permission. He simply sat down on the floor beside me, his back against the wall, long legs stretched out in front of him, as if sitting in a hotel hallway during a wedding reception was the most natural thing in the world. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said, his voice low and smooth, with just a hint of something I couldn't quite place. Amusement, maybe, or sadness. I stared at him, too surprised to respond immediately. Up close, I could see he was probably late 30s, with fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. His expression was serious, thoughtful, as if he were working out a complicated equation in his head. "I'm sorry," I finally managed. "Do I know you?" "Not yet." He extended his hand. "Ethan Cole. I'm a friend of the groom." I shook his hand automatically, feeling the firm warmth of his grip. "Lauren." "I know." The words were simple, but something about the way he said them made my stomach tighten. "David mentioned you might be here." He continued, referring to Rachel's husband-to-be with an ease that suggested they were genuinely close. Though he didn't mention the creative seating arrangement. Heat flooded my cheeks. So even the groom's friends knew about my humiliation. Wonderful. I started to stand ready to finally leave this nightmare, but Ethan's next words stopped me cold. "Meridian Financial," he said quietly, and my blood turned to ice. That must have been devastating. I sank back onto the chair, my legs suddenly weak. Meridian Financial. The name I hadn't spoken aloud in years, the ghost that haunted every job application, every new introduction, every moment when I had to explain the 10-year gap in my resume where a thriving career should have been. "How do you—" My voice came out as a whisper. I cleared my throat and tried again. "How do you know about that?" He tilted his head, studying me with those unsettling, perceptive eyes. "I make it my business to know about financial irregularities, particularly ones that don't quite add up." "I don't understand what you mean." But my heart was hammering now, a wild, desperate rhythm that made it hard to breathe. "Don't you—" He shifted slightly, and something in his posture changed. He was still relaxed, still sitting casually on the floor, but now there was an intensity to him that hadn't been there before. A rising star analyst, brilliant track record, suddenly accused of embezzlement and doctored reports. Fired within 24 hours. Threatened with criminal prosecution if you fought back. And then, nothing. No charges filed. No investigation case closed. That doesn't strike you as odd. Every word he spoke was true, but hearing them from a stranger's mouth felt like being flayed open. I'd spent a decade trying to convince myself that maybe I had made some mistake, that maybe I deserved what happened, because the alternative that I'd been deliberately destroyed was too painful to accept. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded. "Because I think you were set up, and I think I know who did it." The hallway seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the folding chair, my knuckles white. "That's not possible. No one wouldn't they?" His eyes flicked toward the ballroom, toward the celebration where my family laughed and danced and toasted to Rachel's happiness. Some people destroy others because they enjoy the power. Some do it for profit. Some do it because they can't stand watching anyone else succeed. I followed his gaze and saw Rachel through the doorway, radiant in her wedding gown, holding court at the head table. My beautiful, charming, beloved little sister, the golden child who could do no wrong. "No," I said, but the word came out weak, unconvincing, even to my own ears. Ethan didn't argue. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it between two fingers. "Cole Investments. I specialize in forensic financial analysis, finding patterns that others miss, uncovering fraud that's been carefully hidden." I took the card with trembling hands. The cardstock was heavy, expensive, with raised lettering that caught the light. An address in the financial district, a phone number, and email. "I'm not asking you to believe me right now," he said, standing up with fluid grace and brushing off his trousers. "But if you want answers, real answers about what happened to you, call me. I have information you need to see." "Why?" The question burst out of me. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." For the first time, something like emotion crossed his carefully neutral expression. "Because some people spend their whole lives in the shadows of those who don't deserve their light. And because someone should have stood up for you 10 years ago, but no one did." The statement was so specific, so perfectly aimed at the raw wound of my existence that I felt tears prick my eyes again. He'd taken the inchoate pain of my entire adult life and distilled it into a single sentence. "Think about it," he said, already turning toward the ballroom. "We'll talk after the wedding." I watched him walk away, this stranger who somehow knew my deepest shame, my darkest secrets. He moved through the doorway into the ballroom, but instead of joining the celebration, he stopped at the periphery. I saw him lean against one of the marble columns, his attention fixed on the head table where Rachel sat. The way he looked at her made something cold slither down my spine. It wasn't admiration or even curiosity. It was the way a chess player might study the board, calculating moves and counter-moves, looking for weaknesses and opportunities. Who was Ethan Cole? And what did he want? I looked down at his card, then back at the ballroom entrance where he'd disappeared into the shadows. My mind was reeling, trying to process everything he'd said, every impossible implication. And that's when I realized he'd said my name even though I'd never told him what it was. I sat in that hallway for another hour, Ethan's business card burning a hole in my clutch purse, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. The reception moved forward with clockwork precision. Dinner was served on china plates with gold rims. The cake was wheeled out, a towering confection of fondant and sugar flowers that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Through it all, I remained invisible in my folding chair, watching a celebration I'd never truly been invited to join. Then the best man stood up, tapping his fork against his champagne flute to get everyone's attention. He was young, maybe 25, with the easy confidence of someone who'd never experienced real hardship. His toast was exactly what you'd expect: jokes about David's bachelor days, sentimental remarks about finding true love, a wish for eternal happiness. The guests laughed and applauded at all the right moments. Rachel beamed up at her new husband, the picture of bridal bliss. When the best man finished, David rose from his seat at the head table. He kissed Rachel's cheek, took the microphone, and thanked everyone for coming. His voice was warm, his smile genuine. Then he said something that made my breath catch. "Before we continue, there's one more person I'd like to invite to say a few words. He's been a good friend to me during some difficult times, and his perspective has meant more than he probably knows. Ethan Cole, would you come up here?" The polite applause that followed David's invitation seemed to echo strangely in my ears. I watched Ethan stand from his position near that marble column, buttoning his suit jacket with casual precision. He moved through the ballroom like he owned it, weaving between tables with an easy grace that drew eyes. but my attention was fixed on Rachel. Her smile had frozen on her face, stretched tight like a mask that didn't quite fit anymore. Her hand, which had been resting on David's arm, now gripped it with enough force that I could see her knuckles turning white even from my distant vantage point. She was watching Ethan approach the microphone with the kind of intensity usually reserved for venomous snakes or approaching storms. Ethan took the microphone from David, shook his hand, and turned to face the assembled guests. The room settled into expectant silence, 200 people waiting for the obligatory pleasantries, the safe and predictable words that mark such occasions. "Thank you, David," Ethan began, his voice carrying easily through the sound system. "I appreciate the chance to speak today. Weddings are interesting events, aren't they? They're about celebrating love, yes, but they're also about family, about the bonds that shape us for better or worse." A few heads nodded. Rachel's smile had slipped slightly, revealing something raw and anxious underneath. "I've been thinking a lot lately about integrity." Ethan continued, his tone conversational, but his words carrying an edge that made people shift in their seats. "About the difference between who we appear to be and who we actually are. It's easy to look successful, to wear the right clothes, say the right things, surround yourself with beautiful objects and important people. But character, real character, shows up in how we treat those who can't do anything for us, how we behave when no one's watching, whether we build ourselves up by helping others rise or by pushing them down." The atmosphere in the room had changed. Guests were glancing at each other uncertainly, trying to figure out if this was still a toast or something else entirely. My mother had gone rigid in her seat, her champagne glass halfway to her lips. "I want to talk about someone I have tremendous respect for," Ethan said, and his eyes found mine across the ballroom, across the divide between the celebration and my exile. "Lauren Reed, the bride's sister." My name falling from his lips in front of 200 people felt like being struck by lightning. Suddenly faces were turning, necks craning, guests trying to locate me in the crowd. It took them a moment. I wasn't where family should be, wasn't at the prominent tables near the front. When they finally spotted me in the hallway, I saw confusion ripple through the room like a wave. "Lauren is quite possibly the most brilliant woman I've ever met," Ethan continued, his voice steady and clear. "7 years ago, my company was on the verge of bankruptcy. We'd made some catastrophic investment decisions, and I was about to lose everything I'd built. Lauren was working as a consultant for one of our subsidiary firms at the time. She spent 3 days analyzing our portfolio, identified the exact problems we'd missed, and created a restructuring plan that saved us. She didn't have to do it. It wasn't her job, wasn't her responsibility. But she saw people who needed help, and she helped them. That's who she is." The whispers started then, a confused murmur spreading through the ballroom. I saw guests leaning toward each other, exchanging puzzled comments. If I was so brilliant, their expressions seemed to ask, why was I sitting in the hallway? My mother had set down her glass, her face pale and pinched. She was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between horror and fury, as if I'd personally orchestrated this moment to embarrass her. But it was Rachel's reaction that held me transfixed. She had pushed back from the table slightly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the way the color had drained from her face. She was staring at Ethan with naked panic, her mouth slightly open, her breathing visible even from where I sat. David had placed a hand on her shoulder, leaning in to whisper something, but she didn't seem to hear him. "So I want to raise my glass," Ethan said, lifting his champagne flute, "to people who have integrity, even when it costs them, to those who help others, even when they won't get credit. And to Lauren, may you finally get the recognition you've always deserved." He drank, his eyes never leaving Rachel's face. The guests, uncertain but following social convention, raised their glasses and drank too. The applause that followed was confused, scattered people clapping because they didn't know what else to do. Then something extraordinary happened. An older couple from one of the middle tables stood up and walked toward the hallway. The man was distinguished-looking, silver-haired, while the woman wore a navy dress and pearls. They approached me with purpose, and suddenly I was standing, my legs shaking as they introduced themselves. Lauren Reed. I'm Thomas Whitmore. This is my wife, Patricia. You probably don't remember, but you consulted on our family trust 7 years ago. Your recommendations doubled our returns. Before I could respond, my mother was there, her hand gripping my elbow with painful force. "Excuse us," she said to the Whitmores, her smile brittle and false. "I need to speak with my daughter." She pulled me further down the hallway, away from the curious eyes, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. When we were alone, she whirled on me with fury blazing in her eyes. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed. "Making a spectacle of yourself, accepting attention like that. This is Rachel's day, Lauren, her day. Can't you just once let her have something without trying to steal the spotlight?" The accusation was so absurd, so utterly divorced from reality, that I almost laughed. But before I could form a response, I looked past my mother toward the ballroom entrance. Rachel was standing there, partially hidden by the doorframe, no longer surrounded by well-wishers and admirers. She was staring directly at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in my little sister's eyes. I drove home in a daze, my mother's angry words still ringing in my ears. Rachel's frightened expression burned into my memory. The city lights blurred past my windshield as I navigated streets I'd driven 1,000 times, my hands moving on autopilot, while my mind spiraled backward through time. Ethan's toast had done something I'd spent a decade trying to prevent. It had forced me to remember everything I'd worked so hard to forget. 10 years ago, I'd been someone completely different. I'd been Lauren Reed, senior financial analyst at Meridian Financial, with a corner office on the 42nd floor overlooking the harbor. My desk had been mahogany, my chair leather, and my computer displayed 3 monitors showing real-time market data from around the world. I'd earned every inch of that space through sheer determination and 70-hour work weeks that left me exhausted, but exhilarated. I was 28 years old and unstoppable. Meridian wasn't just any investment firm. It was the kind of place where senators kept their portfolios and Fortune 500 CEOs came for advice. Getting hired there straight out of business school had been a miracle. Surviving there required something beyond luck. It demanded brilliance, dedication, and a willingness to sacrifice everything else in your life. I'd given up weekends, holidays, any semblance of a social life. I'd skipped my college roommate's wedding because I had a presentation. I'd worked through the flu because showing weakness meant getting passed over for opportunities. My apartment had been a place to sleep 4 hours a night before returning to the office. But it had been worth it. My analyses were sought after by partners twice my age. I had a gift for seeing patterns in financial data that others missed, for understanding not just what the numbers said, but what they meant. When a manufacturing company's books looked too clean, I'd dig deeper and find the accounting tricks hiding declining sales. When a tech startup's projections seemed too optimistic, I'd spot the flawed assumptions that would doom them within a year. I'd saved clients millions by steering them away from bad investments and toward opportunities everyone else had overlooked. My bosses had noticed. 6 months before everything fell apart, the managing partner had called me into his office and told me I was on track for junior partner. At 28, I would have been one of the youngest in the firm's history. The promotion would have come with equity, with real power, with my name on the letterhead. I'd felt like I was flying. Then came the morning that destroyed everything. I'd arrived at the office at 6:30 earlier than usual because I had a presentation at 8. My keycard wouldn't work. I'd tried it 3 times before walking to the front desk, assuming it was a technical glitch. The security guard had looked at me with something like pity and told me to wait. 10 minutes later, 2 men in dark suits escorted me to a conference room I'd never been in before, windowless, sterile, designed for unpleasant conversations. They'd laid it out with brutal efficiency. Client funds were missing. Financial reports had been falsified to hide company losses. The digital trail led directly to me. They had emails with my signature authorizing questionable transfers. They had login records showing access from my computer at odd hours. They even had bank statements showing deposits to an offshore account that somehow bore my name, though I'd never opened any such account. I'd tried to explain that it was impossible, that I would never steal from clients, that someone must have framed me. But the evidence was overwhelming. The firm's attorneys made their position clear. If I went quietly, they wouldn't press criminal charges. If I fought back, they would prosecute me to the fullest extent of the law and make sure I never worked in finance again. They gave me 30 minutes to clean out my desk under supervision, taking only personal items. My computer, my files, my phone, everything stayed behind as evidence. Walking out of that building with a cardboard box and my career in ruins, I'd felt like I was drowning. I'd called my mother from the parking garage, my voice shaking desperately, needing someone to tell me it would be okay. She'd listened in silence as I explained what happened, how I'd been accused, how it was all a terrible mistake. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Lauren, these kinds of things don't happen without reason. What did you actually do?" Those words had cut deeper than the accusations themselves. My own mother, without hesitation, had assumed I was guilty. When I'd insisted I was innocent, she'd sighed with the weary patience of someone dealing with a difficult child. "You've always been so ambitious. Maybe you took shortcuts. Maybe you got in over your head. Whatever it is, you need to take responsibility." I'd driven to my parents' house that evening, desperate to make them understand. My father had been in the late stages of kidney disease, by then spending most of his time in the recliner with an oxygen tank beside him. He'd looked so frail, so tired. When I'd tried to explain the situation, he'd simply closed his eyes and said he couldn't handle stress, that I needed to work things out on my own. Rachel had been there too, perched on the arm of the sofa, her expression sympathetic in a way that now made my skin crawl. She'd worked at Meridian for the past year as an administrative assistant, though we'd rarely crossed paths, different departments, different worlds. She'd hugged me and told me how sorry she was, how unfair it all seemed. I'd actually found comfort in that embrace, grateful for at least one person who seemed to believe in me. What I hadn't known, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that Rachel had orchestrated the entire nightmare. She'd been dating someone in the IT department, a bitter man who felt passed over for promotions. Together, they'd gained access to systems they shouldn't have touched. Rachel had watched me enter my passwords enough times to figure them out. I'd been careless, trusting, never imagining my own sister would be studying my keystrokes. She'd forged my signature on documents, created false email trails, even set up that offshore account using information she'd stolen from our parents' files. Her motive was sickeningly simple. She couldn't stand watching me succeed. Every promotion I earned, every compliment I received, every moment I shined had been like acid on her skin. She'd spent our entire childhood being compared to me, hearing relatives praise my intelligence while dismissing her as merely pretty. In her twisted logic, destroying my career wasn't cruelty, it was evening the score. The months after my firing had been the darkest of my life. I'd applied to dozens of firms, but word had spread. No one wanted to hire someone accused of embezzlement, even without formal charges. I'd burned through my savings within 3 months. I'd moved from my nice apartment to a studio in a neighborhood where sirens wailed every night. I'd taken a job as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, work I could have done in my sleep for a fraction of my former salary. The poverty had been hard, but the isolation had been worse. Friends from Meridian stopped returning my calls, afraid of guilt by association. My family maintained their distance, my mother occasionally sending brief texts suggesting I get help or make better choices. I'd spent holidays alone, eaten dinner alone, gone to bed alone with nothing but the ceiling and my thoughts for company. I hadn't thought about those days in years. I'd buried them deep where they couldn't hurt me anymore. But Ethan's toast had ripped open every old wound, and suddenly I wanted answers more than I wanted peace. The email arrived on Monday morning, 3 days after the wedding. I'd spent the weekend in my apartment oscillating between replaying Ethan's toast in my mind and trying desperately to forget it had ever happened. My phone had buzzed twice with calls from my mother, both of which I'd ignored. Rachel hadn't contacted me at all, which somehow felt more ominous than if she had. The subject line was simple: we should talk. The message itself was even briefer. Lauren, I have information you need to see. Can you meet me at my office tomorrow at 10? The address is below. Ethan Cole. I stared at that email for 20 minutes, my cursor hovering over the delete button. Part of me wanted to pretend the wedding had never happened, that Ethan Cole didn't exist, that I could go back to my small, safe, predictable life. But another part of me, a part I'd thought had died years ago, was screaming that I couldn't let this go. Not now. Not when someone finally believed me. I showed up at his office at 9:45 the next morning, too anxious to be fashionably late. The building was one of those gleaming steel and glass towers in the financial district, the kind of place I used to work before my world collapsed. The lobby had marble floors and a waterfall feature security guards in crisp uniforms and elevator banks that required keycard access. I gave my name to the receptionist, feeling acutely aware of my department store suit and worn handbag, certain everyone could see I didn't belong here anymore. Ethan's office was on the 38th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The furniture was modern and expensive, all clean lines and leather upholstery. His assistant, a professional woman in her 50s, offered me coffee and led me to a conference room where Ethan was already waiting. He stood when I entered, gesturing to a chair across from him. Between us on the polished table sat a single manila folder. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone businesslike but not cold. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't." I sat down, gripping my purse in my lap like a shield. "What is this about Mr. Cole? Why did you say those things at the wedding? How do you know about Meridian?" He opened the folder and pulled out several documents, sliding them across the table toward me. "I've been investigating your sister for 6 months. What I've found suggests a pattern of behavior that goes back years. You weren't her first victim, Lauren, and unless someone stops her, you won't be her last." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked down at the papers in front of me, bank statements, email printouts, corporate records. My hands were shaking as I picked up the first page. "Rachel worked at Meridian when you were fired," Ethan continued. "She had administrative access to several systems. She was also dating an IT specialist named Marcus Chen, who was later fired for security violations. I've tracked down 3 other people whose careers were damaged in ways that benefited Rachel. A colleague who was up for the same promotion she wanted. A friend whose boyfriend Rachel stole. In each case, there's a pattern access opportunity, and Rachel emerging unscathed while someone else's life falls apart." I wanted to argue to defend my sister, but the evidence in front of me was damning. More than that, it fit. It explained the inexplicable, gave shape to suspicions I'd never fully allowed myself to acknowledge. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you get out of exposing her?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw real emotion cross his carefully controlled features. "Because no one stood up for you then, and someone should now. Because people like Rachel keep getting away with destroying others until someone forces them to face consequences. And because," he paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully, "because she did something similar to me years ago, I know what it's like to be betrayed by someone you trusted." The admission hung in the air between us. I wanted to ask for details, but something in his expression told me that conversation would come later, if at all. "What are you proposing?" I asked instead. "I want to build a comprehensive case documenting Rachel's fraudulent activities. I want to expose what she did to you, to me, to others. Not just for revenge, but to prevent her from doing this again. To make sure the next person she targets has a fighting chance." He pulled another document from the folder. "But I need your help. You know her better than anyone. You know how she operates." I looked at the paper he'd placed in front of me. It was an internal memo from Meridian Financial dated 10 years ago. My hands trembled as I read the header, "System Access Authorization Request." Below it, in neat administrative text, was a request for Rachel Reed to be granted temporary access to Lauren Reed's email account for administrative support purposes. At the bottom was a signature I recognized Rachel's looping handwriting, official and damning. "This is how she did it," I breathed. "She had my passwords. She could read my emails, send messages as me plant evidence. Yes, and this memo was buried in archived files that should have been destroyed years ago. Someone kept it, probably sensing something wasn't right. I found it through a private investigator who specializes in corporate fraud. I stared at that signature, my sister's name in ink that had been dry for a decade. All these years I'd wondered if maybe I'd made mistakes, if perhaps I'd been careless in ways I couldn't remember. I'd internalized the blame because I'd had no proof of my innocence. Now, holding evidence of Rachel's guilt, I felt something crack open inside me, not just anger, but a terrifying sense of possibility. If I do this, I said slowly, my family will never forgive me. My mother will say I'm destroying Rachel's life out of jealousy. I'll lose whatever scraps of relationship we still have. Is that relationship worth protecting? Ethan asked quietly. Has your silence earned you their love? Or has it just taught them that you'll accept anything they do to you? The truth of his words cut deep. I'd spent 10 years being quiet, being accommodating, hoping that if I just didn't make waves, my family would eventually see my worth. Instead, they'd seated me in a hallway at my sister's wedding. I thought about Rachel's face when Ethan had mentioned my name during his toast, the panic, the fear. For once, she'd been the one who felt exposed, vulnerable, afraid. For once, I hadn't been the victim. Okay, I said, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff. I'll help you. Tell me what you need. Ethan's expression shifted, something like relief or perhaps respect flickering in his eyes. He pulled out a contract, a formal agreement outlining our arrangement. As I read through it, I realized I was agreeing to more than just helping with an investigation. I was agreeing to reclaim my story, to stop being the person things happened to, and become the person who made things happen. I signed my name at the bottom, my handwriting steadier than I expected. As I walked out of Ethan's office with a copy of that memo in my bag, I realized I wasn't the same woman who'd sat in that hallway chair. I was done being invisible. The following week, I started working from Ethan's office 3 days a week. He'd set me up in a small conference room with a window view, a new laptop, and access to financial databases I hadn't touched in a decade. The first morning, his assistant brought me coffee without asking how I took it. She'd somehow already known I preferred it black with 1 sugar. When I walked through the office, people nodded and smiled, treating me like I belonged there. No one whispered behind their hands or looked at me with barely concealed pity. They simply accepted my presence as normal, natural, deserved. Ethan had assembled a small team to help with the investigation, a forensic accountant named Margaret, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the sharp eyes of someone who missed nothing, and a young attorney named James, who specialized in corporate fraud cases. In our first meeting, Ethan introduced me as one of the best financial analysts in the business, and neither Margaret nor James questioned it. They simply opened their files and started asking for my opinion on transaction patterns, shell company structures, and suspicious fund transfers. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have my expertise valued. When I pointed out that certain payments to a consulting firm looked like disguised personal expenses, Margaret nodded approvingly and added it to her notes. When I suggested we cross-reference Rachel's travel dates with unusual wire transfers, James immediately pulled up the relevant records. They listened when I spoke. They took my observations seriously. They treated me like a professional, not a cautionary tale. The work itself was intoxicating. Ethan had given me access to financial software that cost thousands of dollars per month, programs that could track money across multiple accounts, identify patterns in transaction timing, flag anomalies that human eyes might miss. I spent hours staring at spreadsheets following the digital trails of Rachel's financial activities. Each discovery felt like fitting together pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for years. Rachel had been busy. Over the past decade, she'd moved money through a network of accounts and shell companies with impressive sophistication. There were payments to contractors who didn't seem to exist, consulting fees for services, never rendered expense reimbursements for trips that appeared purely personal. Nothing was blatantly illegal on its own, but the pattern was clear to anyone who knew how to look. Rachel was siphoning money systematically carefully, in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic audits. I found myself staying late at the office long after Margaret and James had gone home. The building would grow quiet, just the hum of computers and the distant sound of cleaning crews on other floors. I'd order takeout and eat at my desk, barely tasting the food, my attention fixed on the screens in front of me. Partly, I stayed because the work was genuinely engrossing, but mostly I stayed because the alternative was going back to my studio apartment, back to the small life I'd built from the ruins of my old one. Here in this conference room, with its view of the city lights, I could pretend I was who I used to be. I could remember what it felt like to matter. But as the days passed, small inconsistencies began to trouble me. I'd been working through Ethan's files on Rachel, adding my own findings to his existing research, when I noticed something odd. The oldest documents in his collection were dated 15 years ago. Photographs of Rachel at various social events, printouts of social media posts from her college years, even a copy of her undergraduate transcript. This wasn't the work of 6 months as he'd claimed at our first meeting. This was years of systematic surveillance. One afternoon, while Ethan was in a meeting with potential investors, I started digging deeper into his files. There were photographs I'd glimpsed before but hadn't examined closely. Rachel at a charity gala, Rachel at a beach resort, Rachel having dinner at restaurants I recognized as expensive and exclusive. In several photos, she was with different men, always dressed beautifully, always smiling that radiant smile that had charmed everyone our whole lives. When I asked Ethan about the scope of his research, he'd been evasive. "I'm thorough," he'd said with a slight shrug. "When I investigate someone, I want the complete picture." But thoroughness didn't explain why he had photographs from Rachel's college graduation or why he'd tracked down her roommates from a decade ago for interviews. This wasn't professional diligence. This was obsession. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that Ethan had explained his motivations clearly, that I had no reason to doubt him. But doubt had planted itself in my mind like a seed, and I couldn't stop it from growing. The email arrived on a Thursday evening. I was alone in the conference room, working through another set of transaction records, when my personal email pinged with a new message. The sender was a string of random letters and numbers, clearly a burner account. The subject line made my blood run cold. "He's not who you think." I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam or some kind of phishing attempt. But something made me click it open. There was no message in the body, just a single attachment. My hand trembled slightly as I downloaded the image file. The photograph was professional quality, taken at what looked like an upscale Italian restaurant. The lighting was warm, intimate, the kind of place you took someone when you wanted to impress them. Ethan sat across a small table from Rachel, both of them dressed formally, clearly on some kind of date. But it was the details that made my stomach drop. Ethan's hand was covering Rachel's on the white tablecloth, his fingers intertwined with hers, in a gesture of unmistakable intimacy. Rachel was looking at the camera. Someone must have taken the photo for them, with a smile I recognized from 1,000 family gatherings. It was her victory smile, the expression she wore when she'd gotten exactly what she wanted. She was leaning slightly toward Ethan, her free hand touching the side of his face with casual possessiveness. The photograph was time-stamped in the corner 5 years ago. 3 years after my firing from Meridian. 2 years before Rachel had met David, the man she'd just married. I stared at that photograph for an hour, trying to find an innocent explanation. But the way Rachel smiled at the camera, radiant, triumphant, possessive, told me everything I needed to know. Ethan hadn't just known my sister. He'd been in love with her. I printed the photograph that night and barely slept. By 6 a.m, I was showered, dressed, and sitting in the parking garage of Ethan's building, waiting for the security guard to unlock the main doors. I rode the elevator to the 38th floor alone, my reflection in the polished metal walls showing a woman who looked calm and composed, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. Ethan's office door was still locked when I arrived, but his assistant Jennifer came in 20 minutes later, startled to find me sitting on the bench outside. "Lauren, I didn't expect anyone this early. Is everything all right?" "I need to speak with Ethan as soon as he arrives." She must have heard something in my voice because she nodded without asking questions and unlocked the office suite. I went straight to the conference room where I'd been working, gathered the files I'd been analyzing, and carried everything to Ethan's private office. Then I sat in one of his visitor chairs and waited. He arrived at 7:30 carrying his usual coffee and leather briefcase, his suit jacket slung over one arm. He stopped in the doorway when he saw me, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness in the span of a heartbeat. "We need to talk," I said, and slid the photograph across his desk. Ethan set down his coffee with careful precision, hung his jacket on the back of his chair, and picked up the photograph. He studied it for a long moment, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. When he finally looked up at me, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Vulnerability, maybe, or exhaustion. The mask of confident control he always wore had cracked just enough to show the man underneath. "Where did you get this?" His voice was steady but quiet. "Someone emailed it to me, an anonymous account, last night." I leaned forward, keeping my own voice level despite the anger and betrayal churning in my stomach. "You told me you'd been investigating Rachel for 6 months. You said she'd done something similar to you, but you didn't say you'd been engaged to her. You didn't mention that you'd been in love with my sister." Ethan set the photograph down and rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking older than his 37 years. When he dropped his hands, he met my eyes directly. "You're right. I should have told you from the beginning. I was afraid if you knew the full story, you wouldn't agree to help me. So tell me now, the full story. No more evasions." He nodded slowly, then stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city as he spoke. "I met Rachel 5 years ago at a children's hospital charity gala. She was volunteering for the event wearing this simple blue dress, and she seemed different from everyone else there. Genuine, kind. When I introduced myself, she told me she worked in nonprofit development, that she'd grown up in a family that didn't value compassion, and she was trying to make a difference in her own way." His voice carried a bitterness that hadn't been there before. "It was all lies, of course, but I didn't know that. I fell for her completely. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she seemed to understand me. She'd ask about my work, seem fascinated by the details of investments and markets that usually made people's eyes glaze over. She'd bring me dinner when I was working late. She'd remember small things I'd mentioned in passing. She made me feel seen." I stayed silent, letting him continue watching the tension in his shoulders as he relived what was clearly still painful. We were together for 8 months before I proposed. She said yes, immediately started planning this elaborate wedding. Around that same time, she began spending more time at my house, said she wanted to feel like it was our home. She'd reorganize my office, make it more efficient, she said. Help me file documents. I thought she was being supportive. I didn't realize she was photographing confidential files and forwarding them to someone else. He turned back to face me, and I saw real pain in his eyes now. Marcus Chen, one of my competitors, launched a hostile takeover bid 3 months after our engagement. He knew things about my company that should have been impossible to know. Which clients were unhappy, which investments were underperforming, which board members might be swayed to his side. The attack was surgical, targeted, devastating. How did you figure out it was Rachel? I hired a forensic IT specialist to trace the leak. He found that documents had been accessed from my home computer during hours when I wasn't there, but Rachel was. He found emails from her personal account to an address that eventually traced back to Marcus. When I confronted her, I expected denials, tears, apologies. Instead, she laughed. The word hung in the air like something poisonous. I knew that laugh, had heard it directed at me countless times growing up when Rachel had gotten away with something particularly cruel. She told me I'd been too easy. Ethan continued, his voice tight with remembered humiliation. That Marcus had offered her $200,000 plus a percentage of the company if the takeover succeeded. She said I was sweet but not particularly interesting, and she'd gotten bored months ago. Then she took off her engagement ring, left it on my kitchen counter, and walked out. I felt sick. Not because I doubted his story, every detail rang true with the Rachel I knew, but because I was starting to understand the depth of what we were dealing with. What happened with the takeover? I managed to fight it off, but it cost me millions and nearly destroyed my reputation. It took 3 years to fully recover. During that time, I started investigating Rachel, trying to understand how someone could be that calculating, that cruel. That's when I found the others. Others. At least 4 people whose lives Rachel had damaged in similar ways. A former roommate whose boyfriend Rachel stole then dumped after draining his bank account. A colleague who lost a promotion after Rachel spread false rumors about her. A business partner whose company Rachel helped sabotage to clear competition for a friend. And you fired from Meridian based on evidence that was too perfect, too convenient. He walked back to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a thick folder. I've been documenting everything, building a case that shows this isn't bad luck or isolated incidents. It's a pattern. Rachel is a predator, Lauren. She identifies successful people, gets close to them, and destroys them for profit or entertainment. Sometimes both. I stared at the folder, my mind racing. Everything he was saying aligned with what I'd discovered, with what I'd always suspected, but never had the courage to voice. But I also couldn't ignore the fact that I was sitting in the office of a man whose motivations were tangled with heartbreak and humiliation. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked quietly. "Why let me think this was just about justice?" "Because I wasn't sure you'd help me if you knew I'd been romantically involved with her. I thought you might see me as just another bitter ex-boyfriend seeking revenge. And maybe you'd be right." He sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "But that doesn't make what Rachel did to you any less real. It doesn't make the evidence any less valid. It doesn't mean she shouldn't face consequences." I wanted to walk out. Part of me was screaming that I'd been manipulated again, that I'd let myself be used as a weapon in someone else's vendetta. But another part of me, the part that had been analyzing Rachel's financial crimes for the past week, the part that had seen the clear pattern of deliberate destruction, knew that Ethan was right about one thing. Rachel wouldn't stop on her own. She'd keep finding victims, keep destroying lives, keep getting away with it because she was beautiful and charming, and no one wanted to believe that someone who looked like her could be so thoroughly rotten inside. When Ethan finished his story, I asked him the only question that mattered. "Am I helping you stop a predator, or am I just your weapon against the woman who broke your heart?" His answer, maybe both, was more honest than I'd expected, and far more dangerous than I'd wanted to hear. I spent the rest of that morning sitting in Ethan's office, trying to decide whether to continue working with him or walk away from the entire situation. His honesty about his motivations had been disarming, but it had also complicated everything. Could I trust a man whose judgment had been clouded by romantic betrayal? Was I being used, or were we genuinely working toward the same goal? The decision was made for me 2 days later when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't seen in years, but still recognized instantly. Rachel. "Lauren, can we talk?" "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Coffee tomorrow." I stared at those words, my pulse quickening. Rachel never reached out to me. In the years since my firing from Meridian, our communication had been limited to obligatory holiday texts and the occasional family gathering where we maintained a cold civility. For her to initiate contact now after Ethan's toast at the wedding meant she was worried. I showed Ethan the text that afternoon. He read it twice, then looked up at me with an expression I was learning to recognize, the calculating look of someone playing chess several moves ahead. "She's scared," he said simply. "She knows I said your name at the wedding. She knows you're connected to me somehow. She's reaching out to control the narrative before you hear my version of events." "Should I meet her?" "Absolutely, but we need to prepare you first." We spent the next several hours in what Ethan called strategic coaching. He explained Rachel's likely tactics, the psychological manipulation techniques she favored, the ways she would try to make me doubt my own perceptions. He taught me how to appear receptive while actually gathering information, how to ask questions that seemed innocent but would force Rachel to reveal more than she intended. Most importantly, he taught me how to recognize when she was lying, The tiny tells she probably didn't even know she had. The next afternoon, I met Rachel at a cafe in the Arts District, the kind of trendy place with exposed brick walls and artisanal pastries that cost $8 each. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cappuccinos waiting. She stood when she saw me, and I was struck again by how effortlessly beautiful she was. Her cashmere sweater was the color of cream, her jeans designer denim that fit perfectly, her hair falling in glossy waves over her shoulders. She looked like someone who'd never had a difficult day in her life. "Lauren." She hugged me, and I caught the scent of her perfume, something expensive and floral. "Thank you so much for coming. I wasn't sure you would." I sat down across from her, wrapping my hands around the warm coffee cup. "Your text said there was a misunderstanding. What did you mean?" Rachel's expression shifted into what I now recognized as her concerned sister face, eyebrows slightly drawn, lips pressed together in worry, head tilted just enough to convey empathy. "I've been hearing things about you spending time with Ethan Cole, and I'm worried about you, Lauren. I really am." "Worried about what?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if sharing a confidence. "Ethan is not a stable person. I know him, and I need to tell you the truth about what happened between us." She paused, and I saw her eyes begin to shimmer with tears that seemed to appear on command. "We dated years ago. It was brief, and when I ended things, he didn't take it well. He became obsessed, Lauren. He followed me. He showed up at my apartment at odd hours. I had to get a restraining order." I kept my face neutral, though my heart was racing. This was exactly what Ethan had predicted, Rachel recasting herself as the victim, painting him as the dangerous one. That sounds frightening. It was. She reached across the table and took my hand, her skin soft and warm. "And now I'm terrified that he's using you to get back at me. That he's filling your head with lies about me, manipulating you because he knows you're my sister. Please, Lauren, you have to see what he's doing. He's dangerous." I let her hold my hand, let her think her touch was reassuring me. "What kind of lies would he tell?" "I don't know exactly, but he's convinced himself that I somehow wronged him, that I destroyed his business or stole from him, or I don't even know what stories he's created. The man needs help, professional help. And I'm so afraid he's going to hurt you to hurt me." I watched her perform, saw every calculated gesture, every rehearsed expression. What struck me most was how good she was at this. If I hadn't spent the last week learning to recognize manipulation, if Ethan hadn't prepared me for exactly this conversation, I might have believed her. The tears looked real. The concern seemed genuine. Even the slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned the restraining order was perfectly executed. "Rachel," I said carefully, "did you set me up at Meridian 10 years ago?" For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. Then her expression smoothed into confusion. "What, Lauren? No. Why would you even ask that?" "I'm asking directly. Did you have anything to do with me losing my job?" "Of course not." She squeezed my hand, her voice taking on a hurt tone. "I can't believe you'd think that. You're my sister. I love you. Yes, we've had our differences, and I know Mom and Dad paid more attention to me growing up, but I would never deliberately hurt you. That job situation was a tragedy, but it wasn't my fault. Sometimes bad things just happen." There it was, the deflection Ethan had warned me about. She hadn't denied it. Not really. She'd expressed hurt at the question, reframed the conversation around my supposed accusation being hurtful to her, and then minimized what had happened to me as just bad things. She was making me feel guilty for even asking. "Maybe you're right," I said, letting doubt creep into my voice. "Maybe I'm being paranoid." Relief washed over Rachel's features. "It's understandable. Ethan is very convincing. That's what makes him so dangerous. He knows how to get inside people's heads." She pulled her hand back and picked up her cappuccino, taking a delicate sip. "I just want you to be careful, Lauren. Family is everything. Mom is already so upset about the tension between us. She called me crying after the wedding, saying she doesn't understand why there's all this drama suddenly. We can't let some outsider destroy our family. I noticed she'd pivoted to our mother, using guilt and family obligation as weapons. Every word was chosen carefully designed to make me question my alliance with Ethan and feel responsible for family discord that I hadn't created. We talked for another 20 minutes, Rachel weaving her narrative with impressive skill. She asked about my life with what seemed like genuine interest, told me how beautiful I'd looked at the wedding, even suggested we should spend more time together now that she was married and settling into a new phase of life. By the time we stood to leave, she seemed satisfied that her performance had worked. As I left the cafe, Rachel hugged me goodbye and whispered, "I'm glad you're finally seeing clearly." And I realized with a chill that she thought she'd won, which meant she had no idea what was actually coming. I reported back to Ethan after my meeting with Rachel, and we agreed I should maintain the pretense of being swayed by her performance. Over the next week, I sent her occasional texts. Nothing committal, just enough to make her believe she was successfully pulling me back under her influence. She responded with enthusiasm, sending me links to articles she thought I'd enjoy, suggesting lunch dates. I politely postponed acting like the loving sister she'd never actually been. Then the package arrived. It was waiting outside my apartment door when I got home from work on a Tuesday evening. A small box wrapped in expensive paper with Rachel's name and return address printed on the label. For a moment, I considered not opening it, just throwing the entire thing in the trash. But curiosity won out. I carried it inside, set it on my kitchen counter, and carefully peeled away the wrapping. Inside was a velvet jewelry box, the kind that held something significant. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the lid, and when I saw what was inside, the air went out of my lungs. The necklace was exquisite Art Deco design platinum chain with a pendant featuring a central diamond surrounded by smaller sapphires arranged in a geometric pattern. Even in the dim light of my kitchen, it caught and refracted light in a way that spoke of exceptional quality and significant value. But it wasn't the beauty of the piece that made my heart hammer against my ribs. It was recognition. This was my grandmother's necklace, the one that had disappeared 15 years ago after her funeral, the one my father had promised would come to me because I was the eldest granddaughter. I remembered him showing it to me when I was 16, telling me about how his mother had received it from her own mother, how it had been in our family for 3 generations. He'd said it should go to someone who would appreciate its history, its significance. He'd said it should be mine. After grandmother died, the necklace had vanished. We'd searched through her belongings, checked the safe deposit box, asked the funeral home if perhaps it had been removed before the viewing. My mother had insisted it must have been lost somehow, that grandmother had probably sold it years ago during a financial difficulty none of us had known about. Eventually, we'd stopped looking. I'd mourned its loss along with my grandmother, another connection to family history severed. Now here it was delivered to my door like it had never been missing at all. There was a note tucked into the box written in Rachel's flowing handwriting on cream-colored cardstock. "I found this while cleaning out some old storage boxes. It belongs in the family. Maybe you can wear it to my next party. I'm hosting a dinner in 3 weeks. Would love to see you there. XO, Rachel." I read the note 3 times each reading, making my hands shake harder. The casual tone, the cheerful suggestion, the kiss and hug at the end, all of it was designed to look like sisterly generosity. But I understood what this really was. Rachel was telling me she'd had the necklace all along. She'd taken something meant for me and kept it for 15 years, probably wearing it to events, showing it off, enjoying both the beauty of the piece and the secret knowledge that she'd stolen it from me. The suggestion that I wear it to her party was the cruelest part. She wanted to see me display the stolen necklace, wanted to watch me smile and thank her while wearing evidence of her theft. She was testing me, seeing if I'd been sufficiently manipulated during our coffee meeting, checking whether I would play the role of grateful younger sister who was just happy to be included. I couldn't stay in my apartment. I grabbed my keys, put the necklace back in its box, and drove straight to Ethan's office. It was after 7, but I knew he'd still be there. He'd mentioned he was working on a presentation for potential investors. I called him from the parking garage and he came down to meet me, taking one look at my face and guiding me to his office without asking questions. "She sent me this," I said, handing him the box. My voice was shaking, and I hated how weak I sounded. "It's my grandmother's necklace, the one that went missing 15 years ago. Rachel's had it this entire time." Ethan opened the box and studied the necklace with the careful attention he gave to important documents. He lifted it from its velvet cushion, letting the chain pool in his palm, while he examined the pendant under his desk lamp. "It's beautiful, and clearly valuable. Art Deco, probably 1920s, based on the style. My father promised it to me when I was 16. After grandmother died, it disappeared. We all thought it was lost." I sank into one of his visitor chairs, feeling exhausted suddenly. "She's had it all this time, Ethan. She stole it and kept it, and now she's giving it back like it's some generous gift, like she's doing me a favor." "May I?" He was already turning the pendant over, examining it from different angles. His fingers found something I'd missed, a tiny clasp on the back, so subtle it was almost invisible. "Lauren, look at this." I stood and leaned over his desk as he carefully pressed the clasp. The back of the pendant opened like a locket, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was a piece of paper folded into a tiny square yellowed with age. Ethan unfolded it with careful fingers, spreading it flat on his desk under the lamp. The handwriting was spidery and old-fashioned, written in fountain pen ink that had faded to brown. But it was still perfectly legible. "My dearest Lauren," it began, and I recognized my grandmother's handwriting immediately. "If you are reading this, then you have received the necklace as I intended. I leave it to you along with my other wishes for the family. The business shares the investments, the real estate holdings. These should go to you, my eldest granddaughter, because you have the mind and the heart for it. Rachel is beautiful and charming, but she lacks your integrity. I have seen in her a tendency toward cruelty that worries me. Trust yourself, Lauren. You are the future of this family. The full will is with my attorneys, Morrison and Associates. Make sure they honor my wishes. With all my love, Grandmother Elizabeth." I had to sit down. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. My grandmother had believed in me. She'd seen me clearly, seen Rachel clearly, and made provisions to protect the family legacy. And Rachel had stolen this letter, hidden it away, made sure I never knew. "Morrison and Associates," Ethan said quietly, already reaching for his phone. "That's the law firm. We can track them down, find out if the will still exists." I couldn't speak. I could only stare at my grandmother's words, written in a hand that had been dead for 15 years, telling me what I'd never let myself fully believe, that I wasn't the problem, that I had never been the problem, that someone had seen my worth and tried to protect me. As I read my grandmother's words, "Lauren is the future of this family," I felt something crack open inside me, and I realized that Rachel hadn't just stolen my career and reputation. She'd stolen the life I was supposed to have, and she'd been wearing the evidence around her neck at dinner parties for 15 years. Ethan made the call to his private investigator that same night, reading my grandmother's letter aloud over the phone, while I sat in his office still numb from the discovery. The investigator, a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb, promised to have information within 48 hours. He delivered in 36. Morrison and Associates had merged with a larger firm called Brennan Legal Group in 2018, and most of the old files had been digitized and archived. But Gerald Morrison himself, the founding partner, was still alive, 82 years old, and living in a modest ranch house in the suburbs about 40 minutes from the city. Marcus had already made contact, explaining that a former client's granddaughter needed to speak with him about an estate matter. Morrison had agreed to meet with us the following afternoon. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about my grandmother, trying to remember details about her that I'd let fade over the years. She'd been a formidable woman, sharp-minded even in her 80s, with steel-gray hair she wore in a neat bun, and eyes that seemed to see through whatever front people presented. She'd built the family real estate business from almost nothing after my grandfather died young, turning a handful of rental properties into a portfolio that spanned 3 counties. I remembered Sunday dinners at her house, how she'd ask me about school, about my plans, about what I was reading. She'd actually listened to my answers, unlike my parents, who always seemed distracted or eager to redirect attention to Rachel. The next afternoon, Ethan and I drove to Morrison's address, a tidy house with a well-maintained lawn and flower beds that suggested someone who still took pride in appearances despite their age. Gerald Morrison answered the door himself, a tall man, slightly stooped now, with wispy white hair and glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You have Elizabeth's eyes," he said finally. "And her chin. You must be Lauren." "Yes, sir. Thank you for agreeing to see us." He ushered us into a living room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. The furniture was comfortable but dated, and the walls were lined with photographs. Morrison, with various clients over the years, Morrison receiving awards from the State Bar Association. Morrison with what I assumed was his late wife. He offered us tea, which we both declined, then settled into an armchair with a sigh that spoke of aching joints and a long life. "I've been expecting someone to come asking about Elizabeth Reed's estate for years," he said without preamble. "When Marcus called, my first thought was, finally." Ethan leaned forward. "You remember the case specifically?" "Of course I do. Elizabeth was meticulous about her estate planning. She came to see me 6 months before she died, said she wanted to make absolutely certain her wishes were clear and legally airtight. She was worried about her family, particularly about one of her granddaughters." He looked directly at me. "She loved you very much. She was afraid you'd be taken advantage of." My throat tightened. "What happened to the will she created with you?" Morrison stood with some effort and walked to a large oak cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened it and pulled out a locked file box, producing a small key from his pocket. When I retired, most of my files went to the successor firm as required by law. But there were a few cases that troubled me, cases where I sensed something wasn't right. I kept personal copies of those files properly secured just in case. He pulled out a folder and returned to his chair. "Your grandmother's estate was one of them." He opened the folder and began laying documents on the coffee table between us. I recognized the legal language of a last will and testament, the formal structure of asset distribution, the signatures and witness statements that made it official. 3 weeks after Elizabeth died, a young woman came to my office claiming to be the sole heir. She had a copy of what she said was Elizabeth's will, but it looked wrong to me. The signatures didn't quite match, and more importantly, the asset distribution was completely different from what Elizabeth and I had discussed. The original will left 80% of the business shares to Lauren Reed, 15% to Rachel Reed, and 5% to Margaret Reed. The document this young woman showed me split everything equally between the 2 granddaughters, with nothing for the mother. "Let me guess," Ethan said quietly. "The young woman was Rachel." Morrison nodded. "She was charming, confident, seemed genuinely bereaved. But I've been practicing law for over 50 years. You develop an instinct for when someone is lying. I told her I needed to verify the document against my files before proceeding with probate. She became agitated, said there was no need for delays, that her grandmother had told her this was the will. When I insisted, she left, and I never heard from her again. I assumed she'd hired a different attorney to handle the estate. Which is exactly what she did," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "She used a different law firm and presented that forged will to them. They processed it without ever contacting you to verify." "I should have done more," Morrison said, and I heard genuine regret in his voice. "I should have tracked down the family, made sure the real will was executed. But I was dealing with my wife's cancer diagnosis at the time, and I told myself it wasn't my responsibility if the family chose to use different counsel. I've regretted that decision for 15 years. He pulled out another document from the folder, a certified copy of the original will complete with official seals and notarization. "This is yours. I had 3 copies made when Elizabeth signed the original, all properly certified. She was that concerned about protecting her wishes." I took the document with trembling hands and began to read. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was crystal clear. My grandmother had left me controlling interest in Reed Properties and Investments, a company that, according to the asset valuation, had been worth $3 million at the time of her death. There were also specific bequests: her jewelry to me, her personal papers to me, even her recipe box to me. Everything that mattered, everything that carried memory and meaning, she'd wanted me to have. Attached to the will was a letter written in her handwriting on her personal stationery. It was addressed to me, and reading it felt like having her in the room with me again. "My dearest Lauren," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, but I hope not forgotten. I want you to know that I have always seen you clearly. You have your grandfather's mind and my stubbornness, both of which will serve you well in life. Your sister is beautiful and charming, but she has a darkness in her that worries me. I've watched her manipulate situations, hurt others without remorse, take what isn't hers simply because she can. Your mother enables this behavior because she finds Rachel easier to understand than you. But easy isn't the same as good. I'm leaving you the business because I know you'll treat it and the people who depend on it with integrity. Rachel would see it only as a source of money and power. Trust yourself, Lauren.